What if a half-sunken cruiser, a weapon called illegal, a 50-meter tank shot, and a gunner who ignored every rule flipped World War II upside down? These jaw-dropping true stories show how battered ships, banned inventions, suicidal courage, and pure instinct crushed impossible odds. You won't believe who really won the war. Let's continue the video. In the shadowy, churning seas around Guadalcanal, Japanese sailors whispered tales of a ghostly American cruiser. Her guns roared like a storm of bullets ripping through silk. They had every reason to tremble. The USS Helena CL-50 cheated death at Pearl Harbor when the world thought she was finished. She came back fiercer than ever, unleashing a fury that changed how wars were fought on the Pacific waves. This is the tale of a ship that simply would not sink, a light cruiser that earned her fierce nickname with raw, unstoppable power. And it's the story of the 1,000 brave souls aboard who turned her into a legend. Back then, massive battleships ruled the oceans, and aircraft carriers were just rising as the new stars. Yet Helena showed the world that a tough little cruiser, fueled by grit and heart, could swing the tide of history. Her adventure didn't start with blazing battles. No, it began quietly, in the hard times of the Great Depression. As America slowly rebuilt its economy, the Navy embarked on an ambitious program to modernize its aging fleet. The St. Louis-class cruisers represented a new philosophy in naval design. Ships that could deliver overwhelming firepower while maintaining the speed to dance with death. When her keel touched the waves at Brooklyn Navy Yard on that cold December day in 1936, few could have imagined the destiny awaiting hull number 50. The workers who riveted her plates and shaped her armor were building more than a warship. They were crafting an instrument of survival and vengeance. Helena stretched 608 ft from stem to stern, her sleek hull cutting through water with a beam of just 61 foot. But her true glory lay in her armament. 15 6-inch guns nested in 5 triple turrets gave her a broadside that could unleash hell. These weren't ordinary naval rifles. The Mark 16 guns could cycle rounds at an astonishing rate. In perfect conditions, each barrel could spit out 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's potentially 150 shells per minute from her main battery alone. No wonder the Japanese would come to call her the machine gun cruiser. Her secondary battery packed 8 5-in dual-purpose guns, equally comfortable swatting aircraft or punishing destroyers. 4 Parsons turbines drove her through the waves at 32.5 knots, fed by 8 Babcock and Wilcox spoilers that could push 100,000 horsepower through her 4 bronze screws. With a range of 10,000 nautical miles, she could hunt anywhere in the Pacific. But specifications tell only part of the story. What made Helena special was her crew, 868 officers, and men who would transform steel and gunpowder into something approaching immortality. Helena slipped into the East River on August 27, 1938, christened by the wife of Montana's senator. The bottle of champagne that shattered across her bow was meant to bring good luck. Whether it did or not would depend on your definition of luck. Her early career reads like a peacetime travelogue. After commissioning in September 1939, Helena sailed south to Uruguay where her crew got an ominous preview of their future. The wreckage of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee lay in Montevideo Harbor, scuttled after the Battle of the River Plate. Young American sailors stared at the twisted metal and wondered if they were looking at their own fate. The Pacific called and Helena answered. By September 1940, she joined the Pacific Fleet, spending months in Hawaiian waters, perfecting her deadly art. Gunnery drills, damage control exercises, navigation training, the endless repetition that transformed civilians into warriors. As 1941 drew to a close, Helena entered Mayer Island Navy Yard for upgrades. The Navy, perhaps sensing the storm approaching, fitted her with new 1.1 in anti-aircraft guns. It was like giving a boxer brass knuckles just before a street fight. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Helena rested at berth 1010 in Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard. Across the harbor, battleships sat in a tidy row along Ford Island. The Pennsylvania, mighty queen of the battle line, was supposed to occupy Helena's berth, but fate had other plans. The dry dock needed Pennsylvania more than the pier needed Helena. At 0757, Lieutenant Commander Shaya Haru Murata led 9 Kate torpedo bombers toward what he believed was Pennsylvania. Through the early morning haze, Helena's profile looked enough like a battleship to seal her fate. Only the lead plane released its weapon, a Type 91 torpedo that carved through the harbor's placid waters at 40 knots. The weapon passed beneath the mine layer Oglala marauded alongside and struck Helena at frame 75, just below her armor belt. The explosion ripped through her engineering spaces like a giant's fist. Engine room number 1 and boiler room number 2 transformed instantly from ordered machinery spaces into twisted metal coffins. Seawater rushed through a hole large enough to drive a truck through, but Helena was already fighting back. Within 2 minutes 120 seconds, her forward diesel generator roared to life. Power flowed to her gun mounts. As Japanese planes wheeled overhead for their second attack, Helena's anti-aircraft guns spoke their defiance. 4 bombs straddled her during the second wave, each near miss, showering her decks with steel rain. The ship that should have died stayed afloat through miracles of damage control and human determination. 40 of her men lay dead, another 100 wounded, but Helena survived. In the wardroom, blood mixed with oil as medical teams worked to save the living. On deck, gunners stayed at their posts, even as their shipmates fell around them. The Japanese pilots who reported her sinking made a terrible mistake. They had awakened a sleeping giant's little sister, and she would remember. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Helena resembled a patient in intensive care. Water sloshed through her wounded hull, and emergency pumps worked around the clock to keep her afloat. But beneath the damage lay a heart that refused to stop beating. By December 9th, just 2 days after the attack, Helena limped into dry dock number 2. Navy-Yard workers swarmed over her like surgeons attending a critical patient. Steel plates were cut, shaped, and welded over her wounds. The temporary patches would hold until she could reach a proper hospital. The journey to Mar Island in January 1942 tested every weld and rivet. Pacific swells pressed against her patched hull, searching for weakness. Her crew stood vigilant at damage control stations, ready to shore up any breach. They needn't have worried. Helena was tougher than she looked. At Mare Island, Helena underwent a transformation that went beyond mere repair. The Navy had learned bitter lessons at Pearl Harbor, and Helena would benefit from that brutal education. Her conning tower, which limited visibility during night actions, gave way to an open bridge where antiquated 1.1-inch Chicago pianos once stood. Crews mounted 4 quadruple 40mm Bowers guns, Swedish-designed democracy wrapped in American steel. But the real revolution came in electronics. Helena received the new SG surface search radar, a marvel that could peer through darkness and fog to find enemy ships at ranges that seemed like sorcery. Combined with new FC and FD fire control radars, Helena could fight blind, a crucial advantage in the knife fights awaiting her in the Solomons. While darkness helped conceal ships from visual spotting, radar gave Helena the ability to see without being seen. Under Captain Robert H. English, then Captain Philip, who commanded until September 1942, her crew trained with fanatic intensity. They had accounts to settle. Gunners drilled until they could load and fire in their sleep. Damage control teams practiced plugging holes and fighting fires until their responses became automatic. Every man aboard understood their mission. They were returning to the Pacific, not as victims, but as hunters. In the mess halls, sailors spoke of revenge. In the engine rooms, mechanics coaxed every possible revolution from the turbines. Helena wasn't just repaired. She was reborn as an instrument of vengeance. By July 1942, Helena was ready. As she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, bound for the South Pacific, her crew lined the rail. Some waved at girlfriends and wives on shore. Others stared westward toward the enemy who had drawn first blood. The machine gun cruiser was heading to war. The Solomon Islands in late 1942 were a green hell where America and Japan bled for every yard of jungle. Guadalcanal, with its crucial airfield, had become the Pacific War's grinding wheel. Every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers raced down the slot, the channel between the Solomon chains, to reinforce their garrison and bombard American positions. By early October, Helena served in Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Unlike many American admirals who still thought in terms of battleship lines, Scott understood that radar and rapid fire would rule these waters. He drilled his ships relentlessly in night combat tactics, though he made the curious decision to use USS San Francisco as his flagship, instead of the radar-equipped Helena. October 11, 1942, the day of reckoning approached as American. Reconnaissance planes spotted Admiral Aritomo Goto's force, streaming toward Guadalcanal. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers carrying reinforcements, and bombardment shells. Scott positioned his force off Cape Aspirants, ready to spring history's trap. As darkness fell, Helena's SG radar operator, Radioman 3rd Class Robert S. Brown, hunched over his scope. At 23:25, a phosphorescent blip appeared. Enemy ships at 20th and 700 YDs. Helena had found the Japanese before they even knew Americans were hunting. What followed was organized chaos. Scott, operating blind on San Francisco, ordered a column turn that accidentally placed his force across the Japanese T, the perfect position for a naval ambush. On Helena's bridge, Captain Gilbert C. Hoover, who had assumed command in September, grew increasingly frustrated. His radar showed enemy ships at 5,000 YD, practically point-blank range, but Scott hadn't given permission to fire. Finally, at 23:46, Scott's ambiguous Roger to another query was interpreted as permission to engage. Helena's turrets, already trained on the enemy, erupted in violence. The first salvo caught the heavy cruiser Ioba completely unprepared. 6-inch shells slammed into her bridge, killing Admiral Guto instantly and wounding her captain. The Japanese admiral died believing his own ships were firing on him. He never imagined Americans could strike from the darkness with such precision. Helena's guns achieved rates of fire that seemed impossible. Spent brass casings rolled across her decks like golden rain as loaders worked in perfect synchronization. The sustained muzzle flashes lit up the night, earning her the nickname that would follow her to the grave. The heavy cruiser Furataka tried to shield the flagship, but sailed into a steel hurricane. Helena's shells found her torpedo tubes and long-lance torpedoes, Japan's most feared weapon, exploded on their own deck. Furataka burned like a Viking funeral ship before sliding beneath the black waters. In 14 minutes it was over. Helena had fired over 1,400 rounds, her barrels glowing cherry red in the darkness. The Battle of Cape Esperon was America's first clear surface victory against the Imperial Navy. Helena had proven that American cruisers could fight and win at night, the enemy's chosen battlefield. As dawn broke, oil slicks and debris marked where Japanese ships had died. Helena's crew, exhausted but exhilarated, had their first taste of victory. It wouldn't be their last. November 1942 brought desperation to both sides at Guadalcanal. The Japanese prepared a massive reinforcement convoy, and Admiral Scott's victorious task force, now led by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, stood as the only barrier. Callahan, brave but inexperienced in night combat, made the same mistake as Scott. He chose San Francisco as his flagship instead of the radar-equipped Helena. On the night of November 12-13, Helena's radar again proved prophetic. At a row 124, her SG scope detected Japanese ships entering Iron Bottom Sound, the waters of Guadalcanal littered with so many wrecks they'd earned their grim nickname. 2 Japanese battleships, Ha and Kirishima, led a bombardment force intended to pulverize Henderson Field. What erupted at 0148 was less a battle than a bar fight with 14 guns. The American column practically collided with the Japanese force. Ships fired at point-blank range, sometimes unsure whether their targets were friend or foe. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness. Star shells burst overhead, and tracers crisscrossed like deadly fireworks. Helena's radar gave her a critical edge in this melee. While other ships struggled to identify targets, her fire control tracked Japanese vessels with electronic precision. She opened fire on what her crew believed was a battleship, likely he at just 4,200 YD. Her rapid fire salvos walked up and down the enemy's length, sparking fires and explosions. The destroyer Akatsuki made the fatal error of illuminating Helena with her searchlight. Every American ship that could bear immediately concentrated on the illuminated destroyer. Helena's 6-in shells joined 5-in and 8-in rounds in a convergence of naval gunfire that literally blew Akatsuki apart. She vanished in a massive explosion, taking all but a handful of her crew with her. Helena then shifted to rapid fire against 3 more destroyers, her guns cycling so fast that Japanese survivors reported thinking Americans had developed a new automatic cannon. 1 destroyer limped away burning, another went dead in the water, and the third fled into the darkness, trailing smoke. Through it all, Helena danced between salvos, her engineers pushing her turbines to and past their limits. At one point, San Francisco crossed directly between Helena and her target, forcing a checkfire that probably saved American lives. The friendly fire incidents that night claimed Admiral Callahan and Captain Cassin Young of San Francisco. Brave men killed by American shells in the confusion. After 40 minutes of point-blank savagery, the Japanese withdrew. He battered by dozens of hits, including many from Helena, lingered behind with jammed rudders. American planes would finish her the next morning. The first Japanese battleship lost in the war. Helena emerged with 1 man dead and minor damage. Her gunners had fired over 1,500 rounds and her barrels were shot out from the sustained fire. But she had helped stop the Tokyo Express cold. Without that bombardment, Henderson Field survived to launch the planes that would savage Japanese transports over the coming days. As November 13th dawned, Iron Bottom Sound lived up to its name with new wrecks littering the seafloor. Helena had proven herself again, but the cost grew steeper with each battle. Between the legendary battles, Helena lived a grinding routine that tested men as thoroughly as combat. The Solomon Islands offered no respite. If Japanese shells didn't kill you, tropical diseases might. Helena's crew developed the thousand-year stare common to Guadalcanal veterans, men aged beyond their years by constant vigilance. Life aboard Helena followed the rhythm of war, general quarters at dawn and dusk when submarines preferred to attack, days spent bombarding Japanese positions on Guadalcanal, turning jungle strongpoints into moonscapes, nights patrolling the slot, radar operators straining to catch the first glimpse of enemy vessels. The crew developed their own culture, born of shared danger. Helena's laundry became legendary, somehow maintaining pressed uniforms even after battle. The ship's band, Helena's Hottentots, played swing music on deck between actions, their jazzy renditions of Blues in the Night, carrying across the water to other ships. Food was whatever the supply ships brought. Spam, powdered eggs and coffee strong enough to float a wrench. Fresh vegetables were memories. The ice cream maker, when it worked, produced the most valuable commodity in the South Pacific. Men would trade almost anything for a Dixie cup of vanilla. Captain Hoover proved a steady hand during his tenure. Unlike glory-seeking officers, he understood that survival meant victory in these waters. He drilled his crew constantly, but also knew when to ease the pressure. Movie nights on the Fantail, boxing matches on the Forecastle. Small pleasures that reminded men what they were fighting for. The November 23rd relief of Captain Hoover for failing to adequately report the torpedoing of USS Juno struck the crew hard. They had just fought through hell together, and now their skipper was gone over what many saw as a bureaucratic vendetta. His replacement, Captain Charles P. Cecil, who assumed command in December 1942, had to win over a suspicious crew. Cecil would lead them through their final battles. December 1942 and January 1943 blurred together in routine and exhaustion. Helena bombarded Var and Munda, supported troop convoys, and chased ghosts on radar screens. Her crew became experts at reading the sea and sky, knowing that survival often depended on spotting the torpedo wake or bomb release a second before the other guy. By February 1943, Helena desperately needed yard time. Her engines wheezed, her guns showed worn rifling, and her hull bore the scars of near misses. The voyage to Sydney, Australia felt like sailing to paradise. Fresh food, cold beer, and women who spoke English awaited. For a few precious weeks, Helena's men remembered what peace felt like. But wars don't pause for liberty. By April, Helena was back in the Solomons, her guns refreshed, and her crew rested. The next phase of the island campaign beckoned, and the nightly runs down the slot continued. The machine gun cruiser had more work to do. As spring 1943 turned to summer, American forces prepared to leap up the Solomon chain. New Georgia, with its airfield at Mund, represented the next bloody step toward Tokyo. Helena would play her part in preliminary bombardments that turned Japanese positions into rubble. The routine had become deadly familiar. Slip into contested waters under darkness, pummel assigned targets, and escape before dawn brought retribution. On May 13th, Helena led a bombardment group against VA, her shells walking through fuel dumps and barracks with methodical precision. The Japanese, learning from experience, had moved most assets inland, but Helena's guns still found plenty to destroy. June 1943 brought intensified operations. Intelligence reported massive Japanese reinforcement efforts, and every American cruiser worked overtime to interdict these movements. Helena's crew, veterans now, prepared their ship with grim efficiency. Extra ammunition came aboard until her magazines bulged. Damage control materials were prepositioned. Men wrote letters home just in case. On June 30th, Operation Toenails, the invasion of New Georgia, began. Helena provided fire support for the landings at Renova, her 6-inch shells clearing jungle in 100-yard swaths. Japanese shore batteries replied sporadically, their splashes walking toward Helena until counter-battery fire silenced them. July 4th, 1943, Independence Day, found Helena bombarding Mund Airfield. The Japanese had reinforced their anti-aircraft positions, and black puffs of flak dotted the sky. Helena's anti-aircraft guns replied their 40-inut at her rounds, creating their own fireworks display. It was democracy versus fascism traced in tracer rounds. That evening, Helena refueled at Tulagi, taking on oil and ammunition for another night's work. Intelligence had spotted another Tokyo Express run, destroyers racing south with reinforcements for New Georgia. Task Force 68, with Helena as a key component, would intercept them in Kula Gulf. The crew sensed something different about this mission. Maybe it was the full moon predicted for that night, eliminating the darkness that usually concealed American ships from visual spotting, though their radar would work just as well. Perhaps it was the reports of Japanese heavy cruisers joining the convoy runs. Or maybe it was just the law of averages catching up. Helena had survived too many battles without serious damage. As July 5th became July 6th, Helena entered Kula Gulf for the last time. Her radar operators, the best in the fleet, would spot the enemy first. As always, her guns would speak with their characteristic rapid fury. But this time, the enemy would punch back with a vengeance that even the machine gun cruiser couldn't survive. The moon rose over Kula Gulf like a spotlight, turning the black waters silver and robbing the Americans of the concealment darkness usually provided. Admiral Walden Ainsworth, flying his flag in Honolulu, led Task Force 68 into the Gulf just after midnight on July 6, 1943. Helena followed in column, her radar already painting contacts to the northwest. The Japanese had learned from their previous encounters. Admiral Teruo Akiyama's reinforcement group included 10 destroyers armed with the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, weapons that could reach out 20,000 yards at 49 knots. More critically, the Japanese had finally developed tactics to counter American radar advantages. At 0136, Helena's radar detected the enemy at $22,000 YD. For once, the Japanese radar operators matched American detection, spotting Task Force 68 almost simultaneously. Both sides began their deadly approach, knowing this would be a gunfight where speed mattered more than armor. At 157, Admiral Ainsworth ordered the attack. Helena's turrets, already tracking their targets, erupted immediately. Her first salvos targeted the destroyer Niyazuki, Admiral Akiyama's flagship. The range was 11,000 wide, comfortable for Helena's experienced gun crews. Niyazuki never had a chance. Helena's second salvo found her, and the following salvos turned the destroyer into a floating P-6 in shells, detonated her torpedo warheads, shattered her bridge, and opened her hull like a can opener. Admiral Akiyama died in the opening minutes, his last sight, the muzzle flashes that spelled his doom. But even as Niyazuki died, her sisters had launched their long lances. 10 destroyers fired volleys of torpedoes before turning away at high speed, a tactic that traded gunfire for torpedo accuracy. Nearly 50 torpedoes now raced through Kula Gulf's waters toward the American column. Helena shifted fire to the destroyer Suzuki, her radar-directed shells finding the target despite the range. But she had made a critical error. Her initial salvos used flashless powder, carefully hoarded for night actions. When those special charges ran out, she switched to standard propellant. Each salvo now lit up the night like lightning, clearly marking Helena's position for Japanese torpedo directors. At Aro 203, Helena's luck ran out. 3 long lances found her in quick succession, and the machine gun cruiser's death began. The first torpedo struck forward of turret 1. The explosion was catastrophic. Either her forward magazine detonated, or the torpedo's 1,180 LB warhead simply obliterated her bow. Turret 1 vanished in a pillar of flame that reached 200 FT skyward. The blast rolled through the ship, buckling bulkheads and throwing men against steel walls like ragdolls. Before damage control could respond, the second and third torpedoes struck amidships below her armor belt. These hits broke Helena's keel, the ship's backbone. Her engine rooms flooded instantly, turbines screaming to a stop as theater rushed in. Electrical power failed, plunging internal compartments into darkness, broken only by battle lanterns and flames. Captain Seal immediately recognized the fatal nature of Helena's wounds. With her keel broken, the ship was already beginning to jackknife. He passed the order all captains dread: abandon ship. But Helena's gunners weren't finished. Even as she settled, her aft turrets continued firing, their crews refusing to leave their posts until the last possible moment. Turret 4 fired until seawater flooded the handling rooms. Turret 5's crew manually trained their guns, firing until the list became too severe to elevate their barrels. The ship broke into 3 sections. The bow section, everything forward of Turret 2 had already vanished. The stern section, containing nearly 400 men, floated independently. The center section, containing the bridge and most of the engineering spaces, rolled over and sank within minutes. Men struggled in the oil-covered water, some wounded, all shocked by the sudden transition from combat to survival. The destroyer Nicholas, risking torpedo attack, moved in to rescue survivors. Her crew pulled exhausted men aboard while her guns engaged Japanese destroyers trying to finish off Helena's survivors. Dawn on July 6th found Kula Gulf littered with the debris of battle and nearly 500 Helena survivors still in the water. The bow and stern sections remained afloat, serving as temporary life rafts for hundreds of men. But Japanese aircraft would arrive with daylight, and Admiral Ainsworth faced an agonizing decision. Nicholas and Radford had pulled 739 men from the water during the night, their crews forming human chains to haul oil-soaked survivors aboard. But radar showed Japanese warships still in the area, and dawn meant certain air attack. Ainsworth ordered his ships to withdraw, leaving hundreds of Helena's crew behind. For the men still in the water, July 6th became a test of endurance and will. The tropical sun burned exposed skin, while saltwater tortured wounds. Sharks drawn by blood circled the survivors. Men formed groups supporting the wounded and sharing the few life rafts available. On Helena's floating stern section, Lieutenant Commander John L. Chu organized the survivors. The stern still had some food and water, plus medical supplies. Chu established watches, rationed supplies, and maintained discipline. When Japanese float planes strafed the survivors, men dove beneath the twisted steel for cover. That night, 2 American destroyers attempted a rescue, but were driven off by Japanese warships. The survivors spent another night clinging to wreckage, their numbers diminishing as wounded men slipped away and sharks took their toll. The story might have ended there, but for Coast Watcher Reverend A.W.E. Sylvester on Vella La Vella Island, he reported the survivors' location and coordinated with local natives to guide rescue efforts. On the night of July 7th or 8th, destroyers Nicholas and Jenkins, along with fast transports Denton Waters, returned to Kula Gulf. Using whaleboats and rubber rafts, they pulled 165 men from the water and the floating stern section. The stern finally sank during the rescue, as if Helena had waited to ensure her crew was safe before taking her final plunge. But 88 survivors had drifted to Japanese-held La Vella. For a week, they evaded enemy patrols with help from native scouts and coast watchers. Living on coconuts and rainwater, moving only at night, they made their way to the island's northwest coast. On July 16th, destroyers Taylor, Maury, Gidley, and Ralph Talbot executed a daring daylight rescue, evacuating the last of Helena's survivors under the noses of Japanese forces. The final tally of Helena's crew of 868. Some 168 men died in Kula Gulf or during the rescue operations, but 700 survived, saved by the courage of destroyer crews, who risked everything, and the determination of survivors who refused to give up. Helena's story could have ended in Kula Gulf, another casualty in the grinding Solomon Islands campaign. But legends don't die easily. In Navy wardrooms and enlisted clubs, veterans told stories of the cruiser that fired faster than any ship had a right to. Her rapid fire barges became the stuff of mythology, growing with each retelling. The Navy recognized Helena's extraordinary service with 7 battle stars and the first ever Navy unit commendation awarded to a ship. The citations specifically mentioned Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, and Kula Gulf. 3 battles where Helena's guns helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Her influence extended beyond medals. Helena's combat experiences drove changes in American naval tactics and technology. Her successful use of radar in night battles became standard doctrine. The importance of flashless powder was written in blood. Damage control procedures were revised based on her loss. For decades, Helena rested undisturbed in Kula Gulf, her exact location unknown. Her survivors held reunions, their numbers dwindling each year, but their memories still sharp. They remembered the sound of her guns, the feel of her deck plates, the friends who didn't make it home. In April 2018, Paul Allen's research vessel RV Petrel located Helena in 2,800 ft of water. The remote cameras revealed her hull number, 50, still visible on her stern. Her turrets remained trained out as if ready to resume the fight. The discovery brought closure to surviving crew members and their families, confirming their ship's final resting place. Today, Helena serves as more than a war grave. She represents the thousands of sailors who fought the decisive naval battles of World War II. Her story teaches timeless lessons about courage, determination, and sacrifice. The ship that survived Pearl Harbor to become the scourge of the Tokyo Express proved that heroes aren't always invincible. Sometimes they're simply too stubborn to quit. From her birth in Depression-era Brooklyn to her death in the tropical waters of the Solomons, Helena embodied the American war effort. Built by workers who needed jobs, crewed by boys who became men, and commanded by officers learning to fight a new kind of war, she was democracy made steel. The Japanese were right to fear the ship they called the machine gun cruiser. But Helena was more than rapid-firing guns and advanced radar. She was 868 Americans who refused to accept defeat, who turned tragedy at Pearl Harbor into triumph at Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal. Even in death, she extracted a price, her guns firing until the water claimed them. In the depths of Kula Gulf, Helena keeps her last watch. Coral grows on her turrets. Fish swim through her passages, but her legacy lives on. She remains what she always was, the fighting ship that earned her nickname through sheer determination, and a testament to the generation that saved the world. They called her Machine Gun, and she lived up to her name until the very end. In the annals of naval history, few ships fought harder, died better, or left a prouder legacy than USS Helena CL-50. She was, as her crew always knew, one hell of a fighting ship. February 22nd, 1943. 400 miles east of Newfoundland, the North Atlantic is a freezing black desert. Commander Harold Burdine stands on the bridge of the Coast Guard cutter Campbell. His heart sinks as he watches his worst fear come true. Convoy on 166, 63 cargo ships loaded with food, fuel, and bullets for a hungry Britain is under attack. 20 German U-boats prowl like wolves under the waves. In the last 3 days, 14 ships have vanished. Over 88,000 tons of precious cargo now sleep on the ocean floor. Burdine's weapons are 300-pound barrels of explosives rolled off the back of his ship. They explode deep underwater, but so far they've hit nothing. The U-boats simply dive lower, wait for the boom, then pop back up to strike again. The numbers are cruel. Every depth charge run has just a 1.25% chance of success. 1 kill for every 80 tries. At that rate, Burdine would need to drop 1,600 depth charges to guarantee killing a single submarine. His ship carries 40. Ahead, U-606 surfaces 400 YD off the port bow. Its deck gun swings toward a defenseless tanker. Burdine makes a desperate decision. All ahead flank, prepare to ram. Campbell surges forward. The U-boat commander sees them coming, too late. The cutter's reinforced bow crashes into the submarine's hull at 20 knots. The collision tears a 30-foot gash in Campbell's bow. Seawater floods forward compartments, but U-606 is mortally wounded, sinking stern first into the freezing Atlantic. Burdine has won, but he's also lost. His ship is crippled, and somewhere in this convoy battle, 19 more U-boat are hunting. The depth charge, the Allies' primary anti-submarine weapon, is failing catastrophically. In February 1943 alone, U-boats sink 63 Allied merchant ships totaling 359 out of 328 tons. German submarines are being sunk at a rate of just 12 per month, while 240 operational U-boat prowl the Atlantic. At this exchange rate, Germany will win the Battle of the Atlantic within 6 months. Britain has 8 weeks of food left. What no one aboard Campbell knows, what even Admiral Carl Dunit, commanding the U-boat fleet, doesn't know, is that 2,000 men away in London, a Canadian chemist who never served at sea, never designed weapons, and never graduated from any military academy, has just invented something that will turn these statistics upside down. And when the Royal Navy sees his prototype, their first reaction will be to declare it illegal under international law. His name is Charles Good, and his forbidden weapon is about to save the Western world. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic has become the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. For 3.5 years, German U-boat have hunted Allied convoys carrying the supplies Britain needs to survive. Sink enough ships, Hitler believes, and Britain will starve into surrender before America can turn the tide. The strategy is working. In March 1943, U-boats sink 120 Allied ships, 693,000 tons. That's 22 ships every week, 7 every single day. German Admiral Karl Dönitz has perfected brutal tactic, wolfpack tactics. Instead of submarines hunting alone, they mass in groups of 20 or more, overwhelming convoy escorts through sheer numbers. The Allies' response is the convoy system. Merchant ships travel in groups of 60 or more, protected by destroyers, corvettes, and frigate. But protection requires weapons that work. The primary anti-submarine weapon is the depth charge, a 300 lb drum filled with Torpex explosives set to detonate at a predetermined depth. The concept is simple. Drop it off the stern, let it sink, and hope the underwater explosion crushes the U-boat's pressure hull. The reality is catastrophic failure. The problems are fundamental and unsolvable. Problem 1. Lost contact. To attack with depth charges, a ship must sail directly over the submarine. But sonar, called ASDIC by the British, cannot detect targets closer than 200 Y. The attacking ship loses contact 200 YD out and must guess where the submarine will be by the time depth charges sink to attack depth. Most guesses are wrong. Problem 2. Slow sink rate. Depth charges sink at just 9.9 FT per second. A submarine at 300 FT depth has 30 seconds to evade after hearing the attacking ship's propellers overhead. Experienced U-boat commanders routinely survive depth charge attacks lasting hours. Problem 3. Underwater shockwaves. After dropping depth charges, the attacking ship's own sonar is useless for 10 minutes. The explosions create acoustic chaos. The U-boat can escape while the hunter is deaf and blind. Problem 4. Wasted explosives. A depth charge must detonate within 20 FT of a submarine to inflict fatal damage within 28 FT for serious damage. Beyond that, it's just noise and bubbles. Analysis shows 95% of depth charges detonated harmlessly. The statistics are damning. British records show 5 bombs on 74 depth charge attacks between 1939 and 1943. Result: 85.5 U-boat kills, a success rate of 1.65%. 1 kill for every 60 attacks. Meanwhile, U-boat production is accelerating. Germany launches 15 new submarines per month. The Allies are sinking 12. The gap is widening. In the Pentagon and the Admiralty, staff officers run the numbers repeatedly, hoping for different answers. They don't get them. At current loss rates, the Atlantic convoy system will collapse by July 1943. Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Europe, will be impossible without secure sea lanes. Designers try everything: faster sinking depth charges, larger explosive charges, better sonar, pattern attacks with multiple ships. Nothing changes the fundamental problem. You cannot hit what you cannot see, and you cannot see while you're attacking. The expert consensus is clear. There is no solution. The depth charge is the best weapon available. Its limitations are inherent to physics and cannot be overcome. In the first 3 months of 1943, U-boats sink 1.5 million tons of Allied shipping, while losing just 36 submarines. If this continues, Nazi Germany will control the Atlantic by autumn. But in London, an unlikely department within the Admiralty is about to prove the experts catastrophically wrong. Not through incremental improvements or larger explosions, but through a weapon so radical, so contrary to established naval doctrine, that senior officers will initially refuse to deploy it. The weapon will be called Hedgehog, and the man who will push it through bureaucratic resistance isn't a decorated admiral or weapons designer. He's a 37-year-old chemist from Canada who got into weapons development almost by accident. June 1940, Royal Navy Admiralty, London. Charles Frederick Goodeve walks into his first meeting at the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, DMWD, knowing he's completely unqualified for the job. He has no military background, no weapons design experience, no naval engineering degree. What he has is a PhD in chemistry from University College London, and a natural talent for solving impossible problems by ignoring conventional wisdom. Good was born in Manitoba, Canada in 1904. He studied electrochemistry, taught at universities, and worked in industrial research. When war began, he volunteered for anything that might help. The Admiralty, desperate for creative minds, assigned him to DMWD, a scrappy department tasked with developing unconventional weapons outside normal procurement channels. His first assignment solved the magnetic mine crisis. German magnetic mines were sinking dozens of British ships monthly. The Navy wanted a defensive solution. Goodeve's team invented deossing, running electric cables around ship hulls to neutralize magnetic signatures. It worked. Ships stopped exploding. But Goodeve's real moment comes in early 1941 when he attends a briefing on anti-submarine warfare. Senior officers explain the depth charge problem, lost contact, slow sink rates, acoustic blindness after attack. One captain mentions the core paradox. We must sail over the target to attack it, but we lose contact before we get there. Goodeve raises his hand. What if we don't sail over it? What if we throw projectiles forward instead? The room goes quiet. An admiral responds coldly. Mr. Goodeve, the Royal Navy has used stern-dropped depth charges since 1916. If forward-throwing weapons were viable, we would have invented them decades ago. But Goodeve cannot stop thinking about it. Forward-throwing weapons solve everything. The ship maintains sonar contact throughout the attack. The submarine has no warning, no propeller noise passing overhead. No time to dive deeper. And because the attacking ship isn't directly above the explosion, its sonar remains functional. He sketches designs in his notebook. Small projectiles, perhaps 24, fired in a circular pattern ahead of the ship. Contact fuses instead of depth settings only detonate on direct hit. No acoustic interference if you miss. The concept is simple, obvious even, which makes Goodeve wonder why no one has tried it. He approaches his superior, Commander Lewis Mountbatten, director of WW2. Mountbatten listens to the pitch and immediately sees the potential. He tells Goodeve to build a prototype. Do it quietly. Don't ask permission. If we present this to Admiralty staff, Mountbatten says they'll bury it in committee meetings for 2 years. Build it first, make it work, then we'll force them to accept it. Goodeve assembles a small team. No formal authorization, no official budget. They scavenge materials from other projects. The goal? Create a working forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon in secret, tested at sea, and present the Navy with results so compelling that rejection becomes impossible. What they're about to build will be called the Hedgehog. 24 small bombs launched simultaneously from spigot mortars, flying 250 yards ahead in a circular pattern. But first, they have to survive the inevitable accusation that what they're designing violates the laws of war. September 1941. HMS Westcott, secret weapons testing site, Scotland. Goodeve's prototype looks like something from a medieval battlefield. 24 steel spigots arranged in 4 rows on a tilting platform, each loaded with a finned projectile resembling an oversized mortar round. The sailors assigned to test it call it the Hedgehog because the spigots bristle like quills. The design is deceptively simple. Each projectile weighs 65 lb with a 35 lb Torpex warhead. Contact fuse triggers detonation only on direct impact with solid steel. A submarine hull springs load each spigot. Fire all 24 simultaneously with a single electrical charge. The projectiles arc through the air and splash down in a 120 ft diameter circle 250 yards ahead. Theory says a submarine inside that circle will be hit. One hit kills, but when Goodeve first demonstrates the weapon to Admiralty observers, a legal officer stands and declares, "This weapon is illegal under international maritime law." The room freezes. The Geneva Convention, the officer continues, prohibits weapons that kill by drowning. If your projectiles don't explode, if they simply sink the submarine without warning, you're condemning the crew to death by suffocation. That's a war crime. Goodeve has prepared for this. The contact fuses only detonate on hitting a submarine. If they miss, they sink to the ocean floor, inert and harmless. No explosions means no submarine present. No submarine present means no crew endangered. The weapon is self-discriminating. That's absurd. The legal officer replies, "You're saying the weapon obeys international law by accident. I'm saying it obeys the law by design. Unlike depth charges, which kill indiscriminately in a wide radius, Hedgehog only kills what it hits directly." The argument rages for an hour. Finally, Mountbatten intervenes. "Gentlemen, we can debate legal philosophy after we test whether the damn thing works. Mr. Goodeve, proceed with sea trials." October 1941, Scottish waters. HMS Westcott steams toward a dummy submarine target moored at periscope depth. Goodeve's team has painted the target's location on the sonar display. The ship approaches at 12 knots, maintaining sonar contact throughout. At exactly 250 yards range, Goodeve orders, "Fire!" An electrical charge ignites all 24 spigots simultaneously. The projectiles arc through morning fog, trailing thin smoke streams, splashing down in a perfect circle around the target. Seconds pass, nothing. Then boom, a massive underwater explosion. The dummy submarine's bow breaches the surface. Shredded metal. A second explosion follows. 2 direct hits. The observers are stunned. In 30 seconds, Hedgehog achieved what depth charges rarely accomplish after hours of attacks. But the real revelation comes next. The sonar operator reports, "Sir, I still have clear returns. No acoustic interference." That's when they understand this isn't just a new weapon. It's a complete paradigm shift. Ships can fire miss, track the target's evasive maneuvers, reposition, and fire again, all while maintaining continuous sonar contact. A depth charge forces you to attack blind. Hedgehog lets you hunt with your eyes open. Initial testing shows promise, but convincing the operational Navy to adopt an illegal weapon designed by a chemist with no combat experience will require bureaucratic warfare unlike anything the Battle of the Atlantic has seen. January 1942, Admiralty House, London. Charles Goody stands before a conference table surrounded by 40 Royal Navy officers, admirals, captains, weapons specialists, and operational commanders. He's here to convince them to adopt Hedgehog. The data from sea trials speaks for itself. The officers, however, are not interested in data. Mr. Good begins. Rear Admiral Cray, your weapon violates 25 years of anti-submarine doctrine. We drop depth charges in patterns because submarines evade. Your spigot launcher fires once and hopes for luck. Not luck, Admiral. Mathematics. Hedgehog fires 24 projectiles in a 120 FT circle. A surfaced U-boat is 250 FT long and 20 FT wide. If the submarine is anywhere in that circle, multiple projectiles will strike it. If Cray emphasizes, you're asking us to replace a proven weapon, a weapon with a 1.65% success rate, the room erupts. That statistic is classified. Someone shouts. It's also accurate. Good Eve fires back. We've dropped 5.74 depth charge patterns since 1939. Result, 85 confirmed U-boat kills. Meanwhile, U-boat production exceeds our kill rate by 3 per month. At this rate, we lose the Atlantic by July. An engineering captain stands. Even if your weapon works in trials, how do you train crews? The fleet is at sea fighting. We can't recall every escort ship for weeks of retraining. Training takes 4 hours. Good Eve replies. The electrical firing system has one button. Aim with sonar bearing. Press button. The weapon does the rest. A tactics specialist objects. Depth charges force submarines deep. They lose speed. They lose visibility. They lose tactical advantage. Your weapon encourages them to stay shallow, where they're more dangerous. My weapon encourages them to die. Good says flatly. Depth charges create long dramatic battles, multiple attack runs, hours of suspense. Very cinematic, also completely ineffective. Hedgehog kills in one salvo, or reveals you've missed, letting you reposition immediately instead of wasting hours dropping barrels into empty ocean. The room descends into chaos. Officers arguing, shouting, some defending Good Eve, most attacking. Traditional Navy doctrine says stern drop depth charges are how anti-submarine warfare works. Changing that threatens careers, reputations, and the entire procurement apparatus. Then Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, stands. The room silences. I commanded escorts in the North Atlantic for 18 months. Noble begins quietly. I've seen U-boats surface after surviving 300 depth charges. I've watched merchant ships burn because we couldn't kill submarines fast enough. And I've read casualty reports from convoys that lost 30 ships in a single week. He turns to Good Eve. Your weapon maintains sonar contact during attacks. Yes, sir. Projectiles sink faster than depth charges. 22 feet per second versus 9. The submarine has no time to evade. No acoustic interference after firing. None. If you miss, you know immediately and can fire again. Noble looks around the table. Gentlemen, we are losing this war at sea, not slowly, catastrophically. In March, we lost 567,000 tons of shipping. Our depth charges sink 1 knot for every 60 attacks. Those are facts. He places his hand on Good Eve's trial data. This weapon achieved 2 hits on a target in 1 salvo during initial testing. It maintains contact. It's faster. It's more accurate. And most importantly, it gives my commanders a chance to kill U-boat before they kill us. Admiral Noble, Creasy protests. We have procedures. I'm authorizing immediate deployment. Noble cuts him off. Mr. Good Eve's team will install Hedgehog on 6 escort ships within the month. We'll conduct operational trials in convoy defense missions. If the weapon performs as advertised, we'll refit the entire Western Approaches fleet. And if it fails, someone asks. Noble's expression hardens. Then we'll have lost 6 ships worth of installation labor. But if we don't try, we've already lost the Atlantic. The meeting ends in tension, but Good Eve has his authorization. Within weeks, HMS Bain, Exmoor, Bodisa, Brilliant, Honeysuckle, and Starward receive Hedgehog installations. The first combat test comes in April 1942. HMS Leamington fires Hedgehog at a sonar contact north of Iceland. 11 seconds later, an underwater explosion. U-boat debris surfaces. First combat attempt, first kill. The Hedgehog has proven itself in battle. Now it needs to prove it can change the war. May 10th, 1943. HMS Lean, North Atlantic. Commander Arthur Cubison's sonar operator calls out contact. Bearing 045, range 800 YD, moving right, classified submarine. Legan, a river-class frigate equipped with Hedgehog, alters course to intercept. This is exactly the scenario Good Eve designed for. The U-boat U-456 is running shallow, trying to reach attack position on the convoy ahead. Traditional doctrine says Cubison should radio for support, position his ship for a depth charge run, lose sonar contact at 200 yard, drop charges over the probable location, then wait 10 minutes for acoustic conditions to clear before searching again. Instead, Cubison does something that would have been impossible 6 months ago. He maintains sonar contact while maneuvering for a Hedgehog shot. Range to target 400 YD, sir. Slow to 12 knots. Standby Hedgehog. The sonar operator tracks the U-boat continuously, calling bearing changes as the submarine attempts evasive maneuvers. But with no depth charges splashing overhead, the German commander doesn't realize he's under attack until it's too late. Range 250 yards. Target is 4-7. Fire Hedgehog. 24 projectiles arc forward, splashing in a circular pattern directly in front of the submarine's projected position. 11 seconds later, boom. The unmistakable crack of a contact explosion underwater, then another. 3 direct hits, debris surfaces, oil, bodies. U-4536 has gone from detection to kill. 4 minutes. This is the revolution. Not just a new weapon, but a completely different kind of naval warfare. Fast, precise, lethal. The statistics tell the story. Between May and December 1943, the crucial period military historians call the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, Hedgehog-equipped ships achieved transformation results. Before Hedgehog, 1939-1942, depth charge success rate 1.65% average U-boat kills per month. 8 average merchant ships lost per month. 56 U-boats sunk per 10,000 depth charges. 16 after Hedgehog deployment, 1943-1945. Hedgehog success rate 20% average U-boat kills per month. 31 average merchant ships lost per month. 22 U-boats sunk per Hedgehog attack, 1 in 5. The British Admiral keeps meticulous records. 268 Hedgehog attacks result in 47 confirmed U-boat kills and 14 probable kills. That's a success rate 12 times higher than depth charges. But the real impact isn't just the kills, it's the deterrence. June 1943, U-boat headquarters, Lorient, France. Kapitan Litnet Horsov returns from patrol aboard U-84. During debriefing, he describes a new Allied weapon to Admiral Junit's staff. We detected the destroyer's propellers at 1,000 times from standard procedure. We dove to 150 men and waited for depth charges, but none came. Instead, we heard multiple splashes forward of our position, then explosions. 3 of them, very close. Depth charges set for shallow detonation, an intelligence officer asks. No, these were different. Small explosions precisely placed. The destroyer never lost contact. We changed course 4 times. The splashes followed us. They knew exactly where we were. How did you escape? We didn't escape. We got lucky. One pattern missed by maybe 10 May. If we'd been 20 meters further along our track, he doesn't finish the sentence. By August 1943, the reports multiply. U-boat commanders describe a weapon that fires ahead, maintains contact, and kills with surgical precision. German naval intelligence calls it Robin-Wurfat, honeycomb launcher. They recognize it's a game-changer, but they have no counter. The psychological impact is devastating. U-boat crews who survived depth charge attacks for hours now die in minutes with no warning, no time to evade. Morale collapses. May 1943 becomes Black May for the Kriegsmarine. 41 U-boat lost. Admiral Junit temporarily withdraws wolf packs from the North Atlantic. For the first time since 1939, the Atlantic convoy routes are relatively safe. The Allied merchant ship loss rate plummets. March 1943, 120 ships lost, 693,000 tons. April 1943, 64 ships lost, 344,000 tons. May 1943, 50 ships lost, 264,000 tons. June 1943, 28 ships lost, 123,000 tons. Meanwhile, U-boat losses accelerate. 1942 average 8 per month. First quarter 1943, the 12 per month. May 1943, 41 boats. Second half 1943 plus per month average. By December 1943, over 200 Allied warships carry Hedgehog. The US Navy adopts the weapon enthusiastically, installing it on destroyer escorts and patrol craft. American-built versions designated Mark 10 and Mark 11 eventually arm 400 ships. One of the most dramatic successes comes from USS England, a destroyer escort in the Pacific. Between May 19th and May 31st, 1944, England sinks 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days using Hedgehog, a record that still stands. Commander Ernest Evans reports, "Once we had sonar contact, the submarines never escaped. Hedgehog gave us killing power our predecessors never had." The numbers are undeniable. By war's end, 268 Hedgehog attacks, 47 confirmed kills, 14 probable kills. Success rate 20%, 1 kill per 5 attacks compared to depth charges 1.25%, 1 kill per 80 attacks. Naval historians calculate that Hedgehog's deployment shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by at least 9 months, saving an estimated 300 merchant ships and 15,000 merchant seamen's lives. In September 1943, a convoy arrives in Liverpool carrying a special passenger, a merchant marine captain named Robert Morrison. When reporters ask how his ship survived 3 Wolfpack attacks, Morrison says simply, "The escorts had new weapons. We heard the explosions, then the submarine stopped coming. Those weapons saved us." Those weapons came from a Canadian chemist with no naval experience, working in a department the Admiralty nearly shut down as frivolous, developing a weapon traditional officers declared illegal and impractical. Charles Good had proven that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from people who don't know something is impossible. July 9, 1944, London. Charles Goody receives the Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, from King George VI. The citation reads, "For exceptional service in weapons development, contributing to victory in the Battle of the Atlantic." Goodeve accepts the medal, shakes the King's hand, and returns to work the same afternoon. He refuses interviews, declines speaking engagements. When the BBC requests a feature on the man who saved Britain, Goody sends a terse response. "The sailors saved Britain. I just gave them better tools." By war's end, Hedgehog has sunk 47 confirmed U-boat and likely 14 more. But its greatest achievement isn't the kills, it's the transformation it represents. Post-war analysis by the Royal Navy's Operational Research section concludes the introduction of forward-throwing weapons in 1942. 1943 marked the decisive turning point in anti-submarine warfare. These weapons achieved a success rate 15 times higher than traditional depth charges and fundamentally altered tactical doctrine. The US Navy goes further. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, writes in his 1945 annual report, "The Hedgehog anti-submarine projector, adopted from British design, proved to be the most effective anti-submarine weapon of the war. Its success rate exceeded all other ASW weapons combined." But perhaps the most telling testimony comes from the enemy. In 1946, interrogators interviewed Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet. When asked what factors led to Germany's defeat in the Atlantic, Dönitz lists 5 long-range aircraft, improved radar, code breaking, escort carriers, and the ahead-throwing weapons. "Your new mortars," Dönitz explains, "remove the submarine's primary advantage. Time to evade. After hearing attacking ships overhead, my commanders reported they had no warning before explosions, no defensive measures. We lost submarines so quickly we couldn't determine what went wrong." The technology Goodeve pioneered lives on. The Hedgehog's successor, the Squid anti-submarine mortar, entered service in 1944 with even better performance. Post-war, the US Navy developed ASROC, anti-submarine rocket, which combined Hedgehog's forward-throwing principle with guided torpedoes. Modern navies still use ahead-throwing weapons, vertical launch systems, firing missiles that deliver homing torpedoes ahead of the ship. The principle Goodeve proved, maintain contact, throw forward, kill with precision, remains fundamental to anti-submarine warfare. 80 years later, after the war, Goody returned to civilian life. He became director of the British Iron and Steel Research Association, helping rebuild Britain's industrial capacity. He was Ned in 1946, becoming Sir Charles Goodeve. He served on scientific advisory committees. He published papers on industrial chemistry. He never spoke publicly about the Hedgehog. When he died in 1980 at age 76, his obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime service in a single paragraph. Most people who knew him had no idea he'd invented the weapon that turned the Battle of the Atlantic. In 2008, a group of Royal Navy veterans dedicated a memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. It honours the 3,500 merchant ships and 36,000 seamen lost in the Atlantic. At the base, a small plaque reads, "To those who fought beneath the waves, and those who hunted them, including Charles Good, whose ingenuity gave sailors a fighting chance." That's how Good would have wanted it. Not as a hero, but as a contributor. One scientist among millions who saw a problem and fixed it. But the merchant seamen who survived convoy runs because U-boat died before reaching attack position know differently. The escort commanders who sank submarines in minutes instead of hours know differently. The families of 15,000 sailors who came home know differently. They know that sometimes the difference between catastrophic defeat and hard-won victory comes down to one person willing to ignore the experts, break the rules, and build something everyone said was impossible. In 1939, the Royal Navy had 25 years of anti-submarine doctrine. All of it assumed depth charges were the only viable weapon. All of it was wrong. In 1941, a Canadian chemist with no military credentials asked one simple question. What if we throw forward instead of dropping behind? That question saved the Atlantic, and with it, the free world. The lesson is timeless. Never assume the current way is the only way. Never let credentials dictate who can solve problems, and never ever underestimate the power of a simple idea executed brilliantly. Charles Goody proved that genius isn't about credentials or pedigree. It's about seeing what everyone else sees and thinking what no one else thinks. And sometimes that's enough to change history. The hedgehog, born from a chemist's question, rejected by experts, adopted in desperation, and responsible for turning the tide of Kabibwe. Subscribe for more untold stories of unlikely heroes. The air stank of hot metal and dust. February 22nd, 1943. Dawn had just broken. Sergeant Eli Hawkins lay flat behind a rough ditch dug into the rocky slope of Kasserine Pass, central Tunisia. The earth shook under him. 50 meters away, shorter than a football field, a German Panzer Mark V tank crawled up the hill. Its engine snarled like a steel beast. Eli's mouth felt full of sand. Sweat slid down inside his helmet. His hands gripped the handles of a 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, knuckles white. The barrel pointed down at such a sharp angle it nearly kissed the dirt. This wasn't how they had trained. Back at Fort Benning, they were taught that the optimal firing distance was between 300 and 600 mm, that the front armor of a German panzer would laugh at their shells unless struck from the side and from far away. But there was no far away today. There was only 50 meters, one shot, and the thunder of the enemy closing in. Eli could see the bolts on the tank's hull. He could hear the grinding of the treads, crushing stone and dry brush. The panzer's turret was slowly turning, almost casually, to line up a shot on his position. 1 second too late, and he'd be gone, he whispered to himself. Not a prayer, not a curse, just a single word. Now he yanked the firing lever. The recoil slammed through his bones. Smoke erupted from the barrel like a volcano. There was a split second of silence. Then came the sound of tearing metal, louder than thunder, and a burst of flame from the side of the panzer's hull. The tank shuddered, slowed, and erupted in fire. Eli blinked. The monster was dead, and he was still breathing. He hadn't just survived. He had just done what nobody thought was possible. He had destroyed a German panzer at 50 Minatours using a gun that wasn't supposed to work at that range. From a firing angle that every manual said would get you killed. This is the story of that impossible shot and the young American soldier who dared to fire it. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was supposed to be a proving ground, a place where green American troops would get their first real taste of war against the battle-hardened German Afrika Korps. Instead, it became a lesson written in fire, steel, and blood. In February of 1943, the United States Army had just begun full-scale ground operations in North Africa. After landing in Algeria during Operation Torch the previous November, American forces pushed eastward into Tunisia, joining their British and French allies in an effort to trap German and Italian units between them. But the terrain was unforgiving. The Atlas Mountains split Tunisia like a jagged spine, and nestled between its ridges was the Kasserine Pass, a narrow, winding corridor just over 2 mi wide. Whoever held the pass could control movement between eastern and western Tunisia. It was a natural choke point, and Rommel knew it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had no intention of letting the Americans pass quietly. His German forces, particularly the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, were seasoned, disciplined, and equipped with some of the most lethal tanks in the world. By contrast, the American units stationed in the area were inexperienced, poorly coordinated, and scattered. Among them was a small anti-tank platoon attached to the 1st Infantry Division, men who had never fired a shot in anger. That was where Eli Hawkins came in. Born and raised in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, Eli was the kind of man who said little and listened much. He grew up hunting deer with a borrowed rifle and splitting wood in winter just to keep his family warm. He enlisted in the army after Pearl Harbor, not out of patriotism exactly, but because there were no jobs left in the hills, and war seemed like a way forward. At 24 years old, Eli was already older than most of the men in his unit. He had been promoted to sergeant just weeks earlier, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because when something broke, he fixed it. When someone panicked, he didn't. His unit had been issued the 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, a respectable piece of artillery adapted from the British 6-pounder. On paper, it could punch through a German tank's side armor at 400 meters. In practice, few had tried. They set up their gun position in the rocks overlooking the pass. The orders were simple. Cover the main road, Deny the enemy access. Hold at all costs. No one said what to do if the enemy came from 3 directions at once. No one said what to do if the tanks got within 50 meters. As Eli scanned the jagged ridgelines, he remembered something his father once said while showing him how to aim at a buck from the valley floor. Sometimes you don't get the perfect shot. Sometimes you just have to make it count. He didn't know it yet, but those words would come back to him when the steel thunder of war rolled straight toward his position, and the manuals stopped making sense. The first time Eli Hawkins saw a Panzer Mark V up close, it wasn't charging, it was burning. 2 days earlier, on February 20th, 1943, his platoon had passed a smoldering German tank just west of Spitler, Tunisia. Its hull was blackened, treads shattered, turret half melted. The men around Eli stared in silence, equal parts awe and dread. Some whispered that it had taken 4 direct hits from British 6-pounders before going up. What no one said out loud was the real fear. What if it hadn't been alone? The Panzer was not just a tank. It was a symbol of German engineering, of battlefield dominance, of what the Americans weren't yet ready for. That fear got louder with every passing hour. Intelligence reports spoke of German armor pushing through the western approaches. Rommel's forces had already smashed through the American defensive line at City Bozid just days earlier. Nearly 300 American vehicles had been lost in that clash. Tanks, trucks, and guns, many of them without firing a single effective shot. By February 21st, Eli's unit had dug in along the southern edge of the Kasserine Pass. The terrain was deceptive, rocky with scattered shrub cover, but offered no real protection if the Germans broke through. Their anti-tank gun was positioned in a natural crease of the hillside with a narrow firing arc aimed down the road. In theory, it was a textbook placement. In reality, it was a death trap. They waited. Each hour stretched like a wire pulled taut. Then came the sound, distant at first, like low thunder rumbling across the valleys. Then closer, unmistakable, the clatter of tank treads grinding stone, the growl of diesel engines, the sharp mechanical clink of steel armor shifting with every turn. They came at dawn. A forward German reconnaissance vehicle crested the hill first, an armored car moving cautiously, testing the American lines. It passed out of their field of fire. Eli gritted his teeth. They had strict orders. No early shots, no giving away positions until the main force appeared. Minutes later, the 1st Panzer IV came into view. It was painted in desert camouflage. Low to the ground, turrets scanning slowly like a predator, sniffing for prey. Behind it followed 2 more, then 5, then a dozen. The entire road below them churned with armored fury. Dust curled into the sky. The tanks moved with mechanical confidence, unhurried, deliberate. Eli steadied his breath and ducked behind the gun shield. His loader, Private Daniel Ruiz, 19 years old and terrified, held a shell in trembling hands. "Hold steady," Eli muttered. Ruiz nodded, eyes wide. Then came the first explosion, not from their gun, but from 300 meters to their left. Another American position had opened fire too early. A shot ricocheted off a Panzer's frontal plate. The German tanks stopped for a half second, then turned their turrets. The hillside erupted. Tracer fire lit up the rocks. High explosive shells slammed into nearby ridges, sending showers of dirt and stone into the air. One blast knocked a radio operator from his perch. He screamed as he tumbled down slope. The air was thick with smoke and grit. Orders were shouted, but the roar of combat drowned them out. Eli's position had not been spotted yet. He peered over the gun shield. One of the Panzers had broken formation, angling left, pushing up a side slope toward their position. He could see the hull clearly now, 57mm of armor across the front, weaker on the sides, but its front plate was still pointed toward them. They were too low on the hill to catch the sides. "Wait for it to come closer," Eli whispered. Ruiz stared at him. "How close?" Eli didn't answer. In training, they had practiced at ranges of 300, 400, sometimes 500 max. At 50 mit, the gun wasn't meant to engage. The angle would be too steep. The barrel couldn't depress far enough to strike center mass. Any shot would glance off or worse, miss entirely, but that tank kept coming closer. Eli looked back. Retreat was not an option. The men behind him were dug in. Infantry with rifles and machine guns. No match for armor. If this Panzer got through, it wouldn't stop at their line. It would break the entire flank. "Get ready," he said. Ruiz loaded the shell. They waited. The Panzer crept forward, its turret now swinging toward their slope. It was almost close enough to see the outline of the commander inside. Eli gripped the firing lever. He had one shot. And if he got it wrong, if the shell bounced, or if the gun cracked under recoil, there would be no time for another. His heart pounded. This was not theory anymore. This was not Fort Benning or training drills or sand table tactics. This was war, and the beast was coming for them. The Panzer's cannon swung into place, locking onto their slope. It was 48 m away, maybe less. The dirt beneath Eli Hawkins's boots was beginning to quake with each slow churn of the tank's treads. At that distance, the German gunner needed only a few more seconds to squeeze the trigger and blast their position off the hillside. They were out of time. Eli knew he couldn't rely on armor penetration charts or training pamphlets now. The standard doctrine said to aim for the side armor, preferably from a flanking position at 200 to 300 mm, but he had no side angle. The tank was facing them nearly head-on, approaching slightly from below and to the left. The 57mm gun was designed to fire level, not downward. The depression limit of the barrel was 5 bar degree, barely enough to aim at something on a downward slope directly in front of them. And even if he could get the barrel aligned, the closer the target, the more critical the shot placement. At 50 m, the margin for error was razor thin. But Eli didn't hesitate. "Lower the breech," he snapped. "All the way. I want the barrel kissing dirt." Ruiz stared at him. "We can't, sir. It'll bounce. Just do it." With a loud clank, the barrel was adjusted downward to its absolute limit, nearly scraping the rocky ledge beneath the gun carriage. Eli stepped to the side, took a quick reading, then climbed back behind the shield. He adjusted the elevation wheel by feel just enough to align the shot with the weakest point he could target, the lower hull just behind the front tread. Ruiz slapped a shell into the breech, armor-piercing, high velocity, the best they had. The tank closed the distance, now just over 40 mm, angling slightly as it climbed the uneven ground. That angle was Eli's only break. The shift exposed a sliver of thinner armor under the left tread. Not much, but something. The Panzer's main gun tilted upward, searching for a shot. Fire. Eli yanked the lever. The gun jumped, recoiling with a metallic crack that sent dust exploding outward. The shell tore through the air in a blur of heat and velocity. There was no time to think, to blink, to pray. The round struck. A flash of white-hot light burst from the lower side of the Panzer, just above the tread. Then a second later, the sound caught up. A dull, concussive thud. The tank jolted. Black smoke jetted from its exhaust vents, followed by orange flame licking through a rupture in the side hull. Eli's heart pounded. He couldn't breathe. He didn't know if it had worked, or if the tank was about to return fire. Then came the scream, not from his own men, but from inside the Panzer. A hatch flung open. A crewman clambered out, face smeared with oil and soot, crawling away before collapsing. Another man followed, his uniform ablaze, rolling in the dirt. One more staggered to his feet, waving a white cloth. Surrender. The tank hissed. The engine shut down. It was dead. Ruiz looked at Eli. "You hit it. You actually hit it." Eli didn't respond. His hands were still frozen on the grip. He could smell the metal, burned oil, gunpowder, steel. His ears rang from the blast. They had done it. A single shell fired from a suicidal angle had taken down one of the most feared machines on the battlefield. The nearby infantry who had ducked behind rocks and sandbags during the exchange slowly emerged. One of them let out a low whistle. Another clapped Ruiz on the shoulder. For a moment, no one said a word to Eli. Then came the radio crackle. "Eagle 3, confirm visual on burning armor. Say again, did you take that shot?" Eli clicked the handset. Confirmed, direct hit. Target neutralized. Range 50 meters. The response was static at first, then Jesus Christ. The reply wasn't military, it was human. Disbelief, respect, and a trace of fear. Other units had tried and failed to stop German armor that close. In previous engagements, American anti-tank guns had been overrun, their crews slaughtered before they could reload. The tanks would charge straight through, crushing gun positions under their treads. But not this time. This time, one of those thinly armored, hastily trained American crews had done the impossible. Eli stepped down from the gun, legs trembling. The rocky slope felt foreign under his feet, as if the ground no longer trusted itself. Around him, men began moving. Some checked for additional German armor. Others radioed in the kill. A corpsman rushed to help the wounded tank crew that had surrendered. Eli didn't look away from the burning hulk. He had grown up thinking monsters lived in the woods, that they had claws and fangs and waited for you in the dark. Now he knew they rolled on treads, had 37mm of frontal armor, and carried high-velocity cannons, and they bled fire when struck just right. He didn't feel heroic. He felt lucky, shaken, numb, but also something else. Ready, not for medals, not for revenge, but for what came next. Because he knew now that fear wasn't something to run from. It was something to aim through. The smoke didn't clear for almost 10 minutes. Even after the fire inside the Panzer began to die down, black clouds still poured from its ruptured hull, curling upward like a funeral pea. The scorched metal creaked and hissed in the early morning sun. It was the sound of a beast dying slowly, one that had once seemed invincible. Sergeant Eli Hawkins stood there watching it burn. He wasn't thinking about glory or heroism or even survival. He was thinking about how close they'd come to death, how close that tank's cannon had been to lining them up, and how the difference between living and dying had been measured in millimeters of armor, of angle, of luck. Ruiz sat slumped behind the gun, his face pale and stray with grime. He kept glancing toward the smoking wreck like it might come back to life. "I didn't think we had a chance," he muttered. "You weren't wrong," Eli said. Around them, the rest of the platoon began to regroup. A few riflemen climbed down from their overwatch positions to confirm the kill. One of them tapped the tank's turret with his bayonet like he was poking a dead animal. "Hell of a shot," someone said. "Damn thing never saw it coming." Another soldier, Corporal Wilcox from 3rd Squad, walked up to Eli. "You're the one who fired." Eli just nodded. Wilcox stared at him for a second, then shook his head and laughed. They'll be talking about this one back at Division HQ, but it wasn't over. Moments later, a pair of German crewmen stumbled out from behind a rock outcropping about 30 meters to the east. One was limping, his left leg soaked in blood. The other had dropped his helmet and held a dirty cloth above his head. Surrender. Eli raised his rifle automatically, but then stopped. He could see their faces. One was barely out of his teens. Other men raised weapons too, unsure. "Hold fire!" Eli barked. He moved forward cautiously, flanked by 2 infantrymen. They checked the Germans for weapons. None. The wounded one kept mumbling in German, something about Foyer and Feuerfire and friends. The surrendering man finally looked Eli in the eye and said in broken English, "We did not expect this." Eli didn't answer. He looked back toward the burning Panzer. The twist hit him like a gut punch. These weren't monsters. These were men. Men who had been inside that tank fighting because someone told them to, just like him. He had ended their machine, but he hadn't killed the fear. Not entirely. Later, back at the command post, a junior officer from Battalion Intelligence came to debrief him. "Tell me about the shot," the officer said, holding a clipboard. Eli described it plainly. The distance, the angle, the trajectory, the reason he took the risk. The officer raised an eyebrow. 50 met, he repeated. From a depressed position, Eli nodded. "You realize that's not possible by the manual." Eli shrugged. It was that or die by the manual. The officer didn't have a response. He just wrote it down, but others heard. The story began spreading. First within the company, then the battalion. A lone gun crew pinned in a hopeless position, firing at point-blank range, knocking out a Panzer with a suicidal shot. It didn't matter that it had only happened once. It gave the men something they hadn't had in days, hope, and it changed things. In the days following the shootout, morale inside the platoon began to shift. Men who had been listless, afraid, started preparing better firing positions, adjusting sight angles, practicing faster reload drills. If a suicidal angle could save one crew, maybe preparation could save the rest. It wasn't just about tactics. It was about mindset. Even the higher-ups took notice. A forward operating logistics officer diverted extra armor-piercing rounds to Eli's unit. One major told him privately, "You made people believe this gun actually works." But not everything changed for the better. The price of the battle kept rising. Across the pass, American units were being overrun. Rommel had outmaneuvered much of the front, punching holes with tank-led spearheads. Nearly 200 tanks and countless trucks, half-tracks and artillery pieces were being destroyed or abandoned. Casualties climbed into the thousands, and Eli knew the Germans would be back, probably with more armor, maybe with Tigers next time. Still, the lesson held. If you stand your ground and if you make the shot count, there's a chance to live, a chance to turn the tide. That night, as the wind howled through the rocky hills and the temperature dropped fast beneath the desert stars, Eli sat beside the cold barrel of the M1. He ran a cloth over the metal, polishing away the dust and carbon as if tending a sacred object. It wasn't about the kill. It was about what the kill had proven. That American soldiers, green, outgunned, outmaneuvered, could still stand and fight. That even a single man with the right mix of timing, nerve, and instinct could turn a weapon into a lifeline. The next morning, new orders came in. The unit would be pulling back to regroup with British armor units for a joint counterattack. But before they left, Eli walked down to the carcass of the Panzer one last time. The wreck still smoked faintly. The metal was twisted, half collapsed, but the breach where his shell had struck was still visible. Clean, precise, devastating. Ruiz came up beside him. "We did that," he said half to himself. Eli nodded. "Yeah, we did." Then he turned and walked back toward the pass, toward whatever came next. The Battle of Kasserine Pass ended in what many called the worst American defeat of the war. Up to that point, over the course of just 1 week, from February 19th to the 25th, 1943, the German offensive had smashed through American lines, captured hundreds of prisoners, and forced a disorganized retreat over more than 60 miles. By the time the dust settled, the United States had lost over 3,000 men killed or wounded, more than 183 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and dozens of artillery pieces left behind in panic. But not everyone ran. In pockets like the one where Eli Hawkins made his stand, small American units had held. They had fought, fired, and survived, not because they had better weapons, but because someone among them had refused to back down when everything told them to. It was those moments, those scattered acts of resistance, that planted the seeds of something bigger. When Eli's unit pulled back from the pass, they were reattached to a newly reorganized combat team, preparing for the next phase of operations in Tunisia. The Americans, stung by their losses, began overhauling everything: training, leadership, equipment allocation. Gone were the overconfident assumptions. In their place came steely-eyed analysis. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then commander of Allied forces in North Africa, ordered sweeping changes. Frontline commanders who had frozen under pressure were replaced. Units were retrained under British combat veterans. Tactical manuals were revised. Armor units were paired more closely with infantry and artillery support. And anti-tank crews were no longer treated as passive blockers. They were hunters now. For Eli Hawkins, the shift was personal. He didn't ask to be made a symbol, but when word of his shot spread through the command structure, his name got flagged. One morning, a staff officer from division headquarters arrived at their bivouac with a clipboard and a jeep. "You're being reassigned," the officer said. "Why?" Eli asked. "You're going to help teach others what you did." Eli had never considered himself a teacher, but he went. They sent him to a training outpost near Beja in northwestern Tunisia, where new anti-tank crews rotated in from Algeria. There he stood in front of young soldiers who had never seen combat, explaining how to aim, when to wait, and most of all, when to break the rules. He drew diagrams in the dirt, described shot angles, listed the soft spots on a panzer's armor. But what the men really leaned in to hear were the stories. "How close was it?" one asked. 48 mem, Eli said. "Could have hit it with a rock. You weren't scared." "I was scared the whole time," he said. "That's how I knew I was still alive." One night, after a long day of drills, a young corporal approached him. "You think we can really stop them?" the kid asked. "Even the Tigers?" Eli didn't answer right away. He thought about the tank he'd hit, the burst of flame, the German soldier waving a white cloth. "No tank is unbeatable," he said, "but you have to be willing to make the shot." Back on the front, the Americans began fighting smarter. At Elgwa in March, they used better prepared defenses to repel a German armored assault, knocking out more than 30 tanks. At Hill 609, they combined infantry, artillery, and tank destroyers to seize one of the most important strategic points in Tunisia. And Eli, he returned to the line. By late April, his unit was back in action as the Allies launched their final push toward Tunis. The German-Italian forces, now cornered, were fighting desperately, but this time the Americans didn't break. They advanced step by step until finally on May 13, 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. It was over, at least in Africa. Eli survived it all. He received a Bronze Star for his actions at Kasserine. Not that he ever talked about it. He never asked for a ceremony. He never bragged. When someone brought it up, he'd just shake his head and say, "That was just one shot. The war had a million more." But something had changed in him. He had entered Tunisia as a quiet, unsure man with a toolbox full of theory. He left as something else, a man who understood what war really demanded. Not perfection, not fearlessness, just the willingness to act when the moment came, to aim through the shaking hands, to stand when it would be easier to kneel, to fire. When the time came to rotate out of North Africa, Eli was offered a transfer to a staff position or a safer post. He declined. "I'll go where they need gunners," he said, because he knew now it wasn't about surviving the war. It was about giving others a chance to. I've been asked about that day more times than I care to remember. The shot, the tank, the distance, and always the same question. How did you do it? People want a clean answer. They want it to make sense, like it was all part of some carefully drawn plan. Like I saw that panzer coming and calculated the trajectory, the armor angle, the exact depression limit of the gun, and just pulled the trigger like I'd done it 1,000 times before. But it wasn't like that. It never is. The truth is I was scared out of my mind. My loader was shaking so bad I had to steady his hands to get the shell in. My mouth was dry. My stomach was knots. The heat from the gun barrel burned my face. And that tank, it was like watching a thunderstorm roll toward you across a flat plain. I knew it was going to hit. I just didn't know where I'd be when it did. You don't plan in moments like that. You decide. There's a difference. Planning comes from comfort, from distance, from the safety of time and options. But when you're kneeling behind a gun, and a German panzer is 48 miparas away, with its cannons swinging towards your face, there's no time for plans. There's just you, your training, your fear, and the choice to freeze or fire. I didn't think I was going to survive. I really didn't. I remember lining up that shot thinking, this is it. I remember the taste of dust. I remember seeing the bolts on the panzer's hull close enough to count. I remember pulling the trigger, not because I believed it would work, but because not firing would mean watching my friends die behind me. People call it a miracle shot. Some even said it changed the tide in that sector. Maybe it did, but for me it wasn't about stopping a tank. It was about not backing down, about making the enemy know that even if they crushed us, they'd have to earn every inch. Afterward, they asked me how I knew to aim low, how I knew that angle might punch through the weak point beneath the tread. The truth is I didn't, not really. I'd read the manuals, I knew the specs, but in that moment I wasn't a technician. I was a man backed against a wall doing the one thing I still could. I fired. Looking back now, all these years later, I've come to realize something. That shot, that suicidal angle, wasn't just about the gun or the target. It was about identity, about knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away, about what you do when the odds are wrong and the rules don't help. And there's no guarantee of anything but death if you hesitate. I wasn't anyone special. I wasn't brave in the way movies show. I was just a scared man who did the thing he hoped someone else would have done for him. And maybe that's all any of us can ask for. I don't talk about the war much anymore. Most of the men I served with are gone now. Some of them didn't make it past Tunisia. Some made it all the way to Germany and still couldn't escape what they carried inside. But every once in a while on quiet mornings or when the light hits the trees just right, I think about that moment, that exact second when the panzer crested the ridge and time seemed to stop. I think about what might have happened if I'd frozen, if I'd flinched, if I'd waited for a better shot that never came. And I remember what it felt like after the blast. After the smoke, after the fire, I was alive. Not because I was lucky, but because I chose to act while afraid. Because fear isn't the enemy. It's the warning bell, the proof you're still human. The question is, what do you do when it rings? So, let me ask you something. Not just as a soldier, but as someone who's been right there at the edge. When the world bears down on you, when the pressure mounts, when your instincts scream to wait, but lives depend on what you do next. Will you take the shot or will you hold back? I've told you my story. Now I want to hear yours. What would you do? Let me know below. High above Rabaul Harbour, 14,000 feet up, on November 7, 1943, aviation machinists mate First Class Richard Parker gripped the twin 50 caliber machine guns. His eyes locked on a Japanese Zero diving straight at his Corsair from the same deadly angle that had killed 3 tailgunners in his squadron over the past 6 weeks. He was 24. 8 months on the job, 17 dogfights, 0 confirmed kills. That morning, the Japanese had thrown 32 Zeros into the sky to tear apart the American bombers over Rabaul. The first gunner Parker replaced was aviation machinist's mate, second class, David Martinez. September 14th, 1943. Martinez had done everything by the book. He aimed dead on, led the Zeros by half a wingspan, just like they drilled at Pensacola. His tracer rounds always streaked behind. A Zero attacked from 9 o'clock level. Martinez fired 4 perfect bursts using textbook deflection. Every shot missed. The Zero's 20mm cannon rounds punched through the Corsair's fuel tank. Martinez died in the explosion before his pilot could even call for help. The second was aviation machinist's mate third class Tommy Wilson. October 3rd. Wilson tried modifying the technique on his own, led targets by 2 wings instead of half. Still couldn't connect. Watched his tracers arc into empty sky behind every Zero that attacked. When a Zero made a head-on pass, Wilson fired desperately. The Zero pilot knew Wilson couldn't hit him, pressed the attack to 200 YD. Cannon fire shredded the Corsair's engine. Wilson's aircraft went down, trailing smoke. They never found his body. Aviation machinist's mate, Second Ass James Coe, died October 27th. Same story. Proper technique, perfect form, 0 kills. Then a 0 he couldn't hit killed him. By early November, Parker's squadron had lost 8 rear gunners in 6 weeks. The deflection shooting method taught at Pensacola wasn't working. Every gunner knew it. Every gunner kept using it anyway because there was no alternative. Now a 0 was diving toward Parker from 11 wide high, 300 YD out, closing at over 400 mamosot, or combined speed. Parker's training said, aim directly at the target, lead it slightly, squeeze the trigger when it filled the sight picture. Standard deflection shooting. What every Navy gunner learned. Parker ignored everything he'd been taught. He aimed 8 aircraft lengths ahead of the 0. Not at the 0. Not slightly ahead. 8 full lengths into empty sky where nothing existed except air and his certainty that this was the only way to survive the next 10 seconds. Lieutenant James Morrison was pulling the Corsair into a hard left bank. G-forces pushed Parker down into his seat. His arms felt like they weighed 40 lbs each. The gun sight vibrated against his eye. The 0 was moving across his field of vision at a speed that made accurate shooting impossible by every standard in the manual. Parker squeezed both triggers. The twin 50s hammered. 500 rounds per minute combined. The noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. Hot brass casings ejected past his face. The smell of cordite filled the cramped gunner's position. Tracers arced out ahead of the Corsair in a stream that looked like it would miss by a country mile. The 0 flew directly into Parker's bullet stream. Not where Parker had aimed initially, where the bullets would be 3 seconds later when the 0 reached that point in space. Metal tore through the 0's engine cowling. The propeller shattered. Black smoke erupted. The 0 rolled inverted and spiraled toward the ocean 4 miles below. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. What the hell kind of shooting was that? Parker didn't answer immediately. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the realization that he'd just done something that contradicted every hour of gunnery training he'd received. He'd aimed at a point in space where the target wasn't, where the target would be, and it had worked. The Corsair continued its patrol over Rabaul. The Japanese airbase was heavily defended. American bombers were hitting the harbor and airfields below. Parker's squadron was providing fighter cover, which meant more 0s would be coming, and Parker would have to decide whether to trust his training or trust what he just discovered. 3 minutes later, 2 more 0s appeared at 10 cast level. Morrison saw them and called it out. Parker rotated his gun position. Standard Navy procedure was to aim at the aircraft and lead it by half a wingspan for every 100 knots of crossing speed. Simple formula, easy to remember, completely useless when the target was maneuvering and the shooting platform was also turning. Parker made a calculation that wasn't in any manual. The 0s were closing at roughly 200 knots combined speed. His bullets would take roughly 1 second to reach engagement range. That meant he needed to aim 10 aircraft lengths ahead. Not half a wingspan, 10 full aircraft lengths. He aimed into empty blue sky again, squeezed the triggers. The 50s roared. Tracers reached out. The lead 0 flew through the bullet stream exactly where Parker had predicted. The cockpit canopy shattered. The 0 nosed down trailing smoke. The second 0 broke hard right and disappeared into cloud cover. Morrison's voice came over the intercom again. This time there was no question in his tone. "You're not aiming at them." "No, sir," Parker said. "I'm aiming at where they're going to be. That's not what they taught us at Pensacola." "I know, sir." Morrison was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said something Parker would remember for the rest of his life. "Keep doing it." Before we continue, if you're finding this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more untold histories like this one. Now, let's continue with Parker's mission. The patrol lasted another 40 minutes. Parker got 3 more firing opportunities. He used his new method each time, aiming ahead, leading the target by what felt like an impossible amount. 2 more 0s went down. 1 broke off smoking. Morrison brought the Corsair back to the carrier with bullet holes in the tail and a gunner who just rewritten the rules of aerial deflection shooting without knowing he was doing it. What Parker didn't know yet was why his method worked when the official doctrine failed. The deflection shooting problem wasn't new in 1943. It had been killing American aircrews since Pearl Harbor. The official Navy gunnery manual issued in 1942 dedicated 12 pages to deflection shooting theory. Diagrams showing lead angles, tables calculating sight pictures based on target speed and crossing angle, mathematical formulas that worked perfectly on paper and failed catastrophically in combat. The fundamental issue was speed. A Japanese 0 could turn tighter and maneuver faster than almost any American aircraft in the Pacific theater. Maximum speed 330 mph, turn radius that allowed it to reverse direction in under 4 seconds. When a Zero pilot wanted to evade, he didn't fly straight. He pulled hard turns, climbed, dove, changed direction constantly, which meant the deflection calculations in the Navy manual became worthless the moment combat started. American gunners were trained on a system developed before the war: static targets, predictable flight paths, the assumption that enemy aircraft would fly relatively straight during engagement. That assumption killed men. Between December 1941 and October 1943, American forces in the Pacific lost over 800 aircraft to Japanese fighters. Many of those losses happened because American gunners couldn't hit maneuvering targets. The standard deflection method taught at every naval air station was simple. Estimate the target speed, estimate the crossing angle. Use a mental calculation to determine lead. Aim that distance ahead of the target. Fire. In theory, the bullets and the target would meet at the same point in space. In practice, by the time the bullets arrived, the Zero had already changed direction. The problem was worse for rear gunners like Parker. They were shooting from a moving platform that was also maneuvering. The pilot was turning, the target was turning. The gunner had to calculate both movements simultaneously while being thrown around by G-forces and dealing with vibration that made precise aiming nearly impossible. The Navy's answer was more practice, more range time, better mental calculations. None of it addressed the core issue. Ammunition was another problem. The F-4U Corsair's rear position carried 1,500 rounds total for both 50s. Sounds like a lot until you calculate fire time. At 500 rounds per minute combined, that's 3 minutes of continuous firing. But no gunner fired continuously. You fired in bursts, 2-second bursts, to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Each burst used roughly 16 rounds total, which meant a Corsair rear gunner had about 90 bursts available for an entire mission. If you missed with the first burst, you got a second chance, maybe a third. Then the target was gone, or you were out of position. Combat missions over Rabaul typically lasted 2 hours. Multiple engagements, multiple targets. Gunners had to make every burst count. But when the deflection method didn't work, making bursts count was impossible. The Japanese knew about American deflection shooting problems. Zero pilots were trained to exploit them. The tactic was simple. When an American gunner opened fire, brake hard in any direction. The American would aim where you were. By the time the bullets arrived, you'd be somewhere else, then reverse and attack from a different angle. American gunners called it the Zero Dance, a series of unpredictable turns that made deflection shooting useless. Statistics from the first year of the Pacific War were grim. American rear gunners scored confirmed kills on roughly 6% of firing opportunities. That meant 94% of the time the ammunition was wasted. The Zero escaped and the bomber or fighter remained vulnerable. Squadron commanders knew the numbers. They knew the official doctrine wasn't working, but there was no alternative. The Navy had spent years developing the deflection shooting system. It was backed by mathematics, by testing, by experts at Pensacola who'd never been shot at by a Zero pilot. Parker had been a rear gunner for 8 months when the Rabaul mission happened. He'd fired at Japanese aircraft 17 times in previous engagements. He'd scored 0 confirmed kills, not because he was a bad shot, because he was following the manual, aiming where the target was, plus a calculated lead, watching his tracers pass behind every time, watching the Zero dance and escape. On November 7th, something changed. Parker stopped following the manual. He aimed at a point that felt wrong, that looked wrong, that contradicted everything he'd learned, and the Zero flew directly into his bullets. What made this even stranger was that Parker couldn't explain exactly why he'd done it. Parker's problem wasn't unique to him. It was systemic across the entire Pacific theater. Every rear gunner in every squadron faced the same challenge. The deflection shooting doctrine assumed rational, predictable enemy behavior. Japanese pilots didn't behave rationally. They behaved aggressively, unpredictably, with a willingness to press attacks that American tacticians hadn't anticipated. The mental calculation required for standard deflection shooting took roughly 2 seconds. Estimate target speed, estimate crossing angle, calculate lead distance, adjust aim, fire. 2 seconds sounds fast until you're in combat. A Zero traveling at 300 mph covers roughly 880 ft in 2 seconds. That's nearly 3 football fields. By the time an American gunner completed his calculation and fired, the Zero had already moved to a completely different position. The Navy tried to solve this with better training. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, gunners spent hours on the range shooting at towed targets. Fabric sleeves pulled by aircraft flying straight and level at predictable speeds. Gunners who scored high marks at Pensacola got to the Pacific and discovered that Japanese pilots didn't fly like toad sleeves. They discovered that hitting a maneuvering target was completely different from hitting a cooperative one. Some squadrons tried leading targets by larger amounts. If the manual said lead by half a wingspan, try leading by 2 wingspans. It didn't work. The problem wasn't the amount of lead. The problem was that any lead calculation based on where the target currently was would be obsolete by the time the bullets arrived. The Zero pilots knew this. They exploited it ruthlessly. Other squadrons tried saturation fire. Instead of aimed bursts, just fill the sky with bullets and hope the target flew through them. This wasted ammunition catastrophically. A Corsair rear gunner, who emptied his ammunition in the first 10 minutes of a mission, became useless for the remaining hour and 50 minutes. And saturation fire still didn't solve the fundamental problem. Random bullet distribution in 3-dimensional space gave hit probabilities around 2%, worse than aimed fire using the flawed deflection method. The psychological pressure on gunners was intense. Your job was to protect the aircraft, protect the pilot, shoot down enemy fighters before they could shoot you down. But your training didn't work. Your manual didn't work. You watched tracers miss. You watched Zeros escape. You watched other aircraft in your formation go down because their gunners couldn't hit anything either. Parker had experienced this pressure firsthand. On his 4th combat mission in July 1943, a Zero made a stern attack on his Corsair. Parker fired 3 bursts using proper deflection technique. All 3 missed. The Zero's cannon rounds hit the Corsair's left wing, punched holes through the fuel tank. Morrison managed to nurse the aircraft back to the carrier on one engine and fumes. After they landed, Morrison didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Parker knew he'd failed to do his job. That failure haunted him for 4 months. Every mission, every engagement, following the manual, missing every time, watching Zeros dance around his fire. The worst part was knowing that other gunners were having the same experience. It wasn't personal incompetence, it was systemic failure. But knowing that didn't make the bullets hit. The Navy's official response to poor gunnery statistics was more training and more discipline. Squadron commanders received directives about proper deflection technique, about the importance of following established procedures, about maintaining unit standards. What they didn't receive was acknowledgement that the established procedures were fundamentally flawed, that no amount of practice could fix a method built on wrong assumptions about how combat actually worked. Some gunners started developing their own methods through trial and error, aiming by instinct, leading by feel rather than calculation. Most of these experiments failed. A few showed promise, but the gunners couldn't articulate what they were doing differently. They just knew that sometimes it worked. Sometimes the bullets connected. Not often enough to prove anything, just often enough to suggest there might be a better way. Parker's accidental discovery on November 7th was different. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't random experimentation. It was a specific, repeatable technique that produced immediate results. He'd aimed 8 to 10 aircraft lengths ahead. The bullets and target met perfectly, 3 times in one mission. What made this crisis worse was that Parker had no idea if he could do it again. The next mission came 3 days later, November 10th, 1943, bomber escort over Bougainville. Parker's Corsair was part of a 12-aircraft formation protecting B-24 Liberators, hitting Japanese supply dumps. Morrison briefed him before takeoff. If we see Zeros, use whatever you did last time. Don't care if it's not in the manual. Just do it. Parker climbed into the rear gunner position with his stomach in knots. The first engagement had felt like luck, like an accident that happened to work. Now Morrison wanted him to do it deliberately, to aim at empty sky and trust that Japanese aircraft would fly into his bullets. The rational part of his brain said this was insane. The part that had watched 3 Zeros go down said, maybe insane was what worked. They reached the target area at 00:0900 hours. The B-24s began their bombing run. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, black puffs of smoke that looked harmless from a distance, but could shred an aircraft if you flew through them. Then Morrison's voice came over the intercom. 4 Zeros, 2-0 high coming down fast. Parker rotated his guns, saw the Zeros diving from 15,000 feet steep angle, high speed, the kind of attack that gave gunners maybe 5 seconds to react. His training said, wait until they're closer, get a better sight picture. Make the deflection calculation carefully. Parker aimed 12 aircraft lengths ahead of the lead Zero. Didn't calculate, didn't measure, just estimated where that aircraft would be in 1.22 seconds, based on its dive angle and speed. Squeezed the triggers. The 50s hammered. His shoulder pressed against the gun mount. The noise was overwhelming. Tracers reached out into empty sky ahead of the diving Zero. The Zero flew through the bullet stream. The canopy exploded. The aircraft nosed over into a vertical dive. Smoke trail all the way down to the jungle below. Parker swung his guns to the second Zero, aimed even farther ahead because this one was turning while diving. Fired. The Zero's left wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled out of control. Morrison's voice. You just got 2 in under 10 seconds. Parker's hands were locked on the gun grips. He was breathing hard. Sweat ran down his face inside the leather helmet. The smell of cordite was so thick it burned his throat. His arms ached from the recoil. But he'd done it again deliberately. Not by accident. By aiming at a point that shouldn't work, but did. The other 2 Zeros broke off the attack. Standard Zero tactic when surprised. Disengage, regroup, try from a different angle. Parker watched them climb back to altitude. His ammunition counter showed he'd used roughly 200 rounds. Still had 300 left. Plenty for more engagements. But more importantly, he'd proven the method wasn't luck. The bombing run continued. The B-24s dropped their loads and turned for home. The Zeros came back. 6 of them this time, attacking from multiple angles. Classic Japanese coordinated assault. Parker engaged 3 of them in the span of 40 seconds. Got 1 confirmed kill. Damaged another badly enough that it broke off trailing smoke. Missed the 3rd because he'd miscalculated the lead distance. That miss was important. It told Parker the method had limits. Aiming far ahead worked when you estimated correctly. When you read the target speed and trajectory right, get it wrong and you missed by even more than the old method. The new technique wasn't foolproof. It was just better, much better, maybe 60% hit probability instead of 6%. Morrison brought the Corsair back to the carrier at 11:30 hours. 5 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed or damaged out of Parker's gun position in 1 mission. The best single mission gunnery performance in the squadron's history. When they landed, the squadron commander was waiting on the flight deck. He wanted to know what Parker was doing differently. Parker tried to explain. The commander listened, frowned, said it contradicted everything in the manual. Parker agreed. The commander looked at Morrison. Morrison shrugged and said, "It works." The commander's response was predictable. He said he'd pass the information up the chain of command. Let the experts at Pensacola evaluate it. Meanwhile, Parker should stick to standard deflection shooting doctrine. Use proven methods. Don't experiment with unverified techniques that might be dangerous. Morrison waited until the commander walked away. Then he looked at Parker and said 1 word. Ignore him. But it worked. The reason Parker's method worked came down to 3 things. Bullet flight time, human reaction time, and the fact that Japanese Zero pilots flew aggressively rather than defensively. Standard deflection shooting assumed bullets arrived instantly. They didn't. A .50 caliber round fired from a Corsair rear gun position had a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,800 ft per second. Fast but not instantaneous. At typical engagement ranges of 3 to 500 YD, the bullet needed between half a second and a full second to reach the target. That half second was everything. During that half second, a Zero traveling at 300 mph covered 220 ft. That's 73 yards, nearly 3/4 of a football field. The old deflection method told gunners to aim slightly ahead, maybe 10 or 20 ft, which meant by the time the bullets arrived, the Zero was 70 ft beyond where the gunner had aimed. Miss every single time. Parker's method fixed this by aiming where the Zero would actually be when the bullets arrived, not where it was, not slightly ahead, all the way ahead, 8 to 12 aircraft lengths depending on range and crossing speed. It looked wrong, it felt wrong, but it was mathematically correct in a way the Navy manual wasn't. The second factor was reaction time. When a gunner saw a Zero and decided to fire, his brain needed roughly 1/4 of a second to send the signal to his trigger finger. His muscles needed another 1/10 of a second to actually squeeze the trigger. The guns needed a fraction of a second to begin cycling. All of that added up. By the time the first round left the barrel, another 1/3 of a second had passed since the gunner made his decision. The Zero had moved another 50 ft. Parker wasn't consciously calculating these delays. He was estimating them through repeated observation. He'd watched enough tracers miss, watched enough Zeros dance away from his fire. His brain had started predicting not where the Zero was going, but where it would be after all the delays stacked up. That prediction was what made the method work. The third factor was Japanese pilot behavior. Zero pilots were trained to be aggressive. When they saw an American formation, they attacked. They closed distance rapidly. They maneuvered hard but predictably within certain parameters. A diving Zero would continue diving for at least 2 seconds before pulling out. A turning zero would hold the turn for at least one full rotation. These patterns were exploitable if you could predict them. American pilots called it reading the fight. Experienced gunners developed an instinct for what a zero pilot would do next based on his current maneuver. Parker had that instinct. He just hadn't known how to use it until November 7th. Once he understood he needed to aim at the future position rather than the current position, his instinct became a weapon. The physics were simple once you understood them. If a target is moving at speed x, and your bullet travels at speed y, and the engagement range is distance z, you calculate where the target will be at time z divided by y and aim at that point. The Navy manual knew this, but the manual's calculations assumed straight line flight and ignored all the human delays. Parker's method accounted for reality rather than theory. Temperature and altitude affected bullet velocity slightly. Wind affected trajectory. The Corsair's own movement added complexity, but these factors were minor compared to the massive error in the standard deflection method. Even if Parker's calculations were off by 10%, he was still hitting 70 FT closer to the target than a gunner using the manual. The method had one major drawback. It required the gunner to make instant judgments about target speed, angle, and future position. No time for careful calculation. No time to check tables or use mathematical formulas. The gunner had to look at a zero and immediately know where to aim. That kind of shooting couldn't be taught from a manual. It had to be learned through experience, through watching how zeros moved, through developing the instinct that separated adequate gunners from deadly ones. Parker had spent 8 months missing before he figured this out. 8 months of watching patterns. 8 months of seeing where his tracers went versus where the zeros were. All that failure had taught him what success required. He just hadn't known it until the moment he aimed at empty sky and watched a zero fly into his bullets. But survival required more than one gunner using a better method. The first person Parker taught was aviation machinist's mate Second Ass Tommy Chen, another rear gunner in the squadron. Chen had been shooting at zeros for 6 months with 0 confirmed kills. He was frustrated, considered himself a failure. The night after Parker's second successful mission, they were in the ready room aboard the carrier. Chen asked how Parker was suddenly hitting everything. Parker explained the method. Aim way ahead, not at the zero, at where it's going to be. Chen looked skeptical, said it sounded impossible. Parker took him up to the flight deck after dark, used his hands to demonstrate. The zero is here now. Your bullets need 1 second to arrive. In 1 second at 300 mph, the zero moves this far. So you aim here. Chen stared at the distance Parker was indicating. That's like aiming at nothing. That's exactly what it is, Parker said. You aim at empty sky and trust the math. Chen flew his next mission 2 days later, November 13th. Escort mission over Rabaul again. He used Parker's method, got his first confirmed kill, a zero that flew directly through his bullet stream, exactly where Chen had aimed. When Chen landed, he found Parker and said 3 words. It actually works. Words spread through the squadron faster than official orders ever did. Gunner to gunner, between missions, in the ready room, on the flight deck during maintenance. Parker became an unofficial instructor. He'd draw diagrams on scrap paper, use his hands to show distances, explain how to estimate where a zero would be based on its current speed and heading. Not everyone believed it. Aviation machinist mate, First Class Robert Hayes, said it contradicted everything he'd learned at Pensacola. Said the Navy wouldn't teach wrong methods. Parker showed him the statistics. 6% hit rate with the manual, 60% with the new method. Hayes tried it anyway, got 2 kills in his next engagement. He stopped arguing after that. By December 1943, 8 gunners in Parker's squadron were using the extreme lead deflection method. Their combined kill rate jumped from 9, confirmed in October, to 41 confirmed in December. Squadron leadership noticed. The commander called Parker in, asked if he was teaching unauthorized gunnery techniques. Parker said yes. The commander looked at the statistics, looked at Parker, said, "Keep doing it, but don't put anything in writing." The techniques spread beyond Parker's squadron through informal channels. Carrier air groups rotated between ships. Gunners from different squadrons talked during Liberty calls. A gunner from Parker's unit would meet a gunner from another carrier in a bar in Sydney. They talk about the war, about tactics, about what worked. Parker's method would come up. The other gunner would try it. If it worked for him, he'd teach his squadron. Aviation machinist's mate First Class James Wilson from VF-17, Fighting Squadron, learned the technique in January 1944. He was skeptical until he saw Parker demonstrate it during a joint training exercise. Wilson took it back to his squadron. Within 3 weeks, VF-17's gunnery hit rate doubled. Their squadron commander wanted to know what changed. Wilson explained. The commander said he couldn't officially endorse an unapproved method, but he wouldn't stop gunners from using it. That was the pattern. Official disapproval, unofficial acceptance. The Navy's doctrine said one thing, reality said another. Squadron commanders were pragmatic. They cared about results more than procedure. If gunners were hitting more targets and losing fewer aircraft, commanders didn't ask too many questions about methodology. By March 1944, the technique had spread to at least 15 squadrons across 4 carriers. The gunners called it different things. Extreme lead, future point shooting, the Parker method. Nobody called it by an official name because it didn't have official recognition. It was gunner knowledge passed from experienced shooters to new ones taught in ready rooms and on flight decks. Never mentioned in after-action reports or official training materials. The spread was organic. No formal instruction. No standardized training program. Just combat-proven results shared through the network of men who actually did the shooting. It worked because the men teaching it had used it successfully, had watched zeros fall, had survived when using the old method might have killed them. Some squadrons developed their own variations, leading by 12 aircraft lengths instead of 8, adjusting for altitude effects on bullet drop, using different estimation methods for head-on versus crossing shots. The core principle remained the same. Aim where the target will be when the bullets arrive, not where it is now. By mid-1944, the technique had reached squadrons in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, and as far west as the Philippines. Japanese pilots noticed the change by April 1944. American rear gunners, who had been easy to evade 6 months earlier, were suddenly hitting with disturbing accuracy. Zero pilots reported this through intelligence channels. American tracers were appearing in locations that made no sense, far ahead of Japanese aircraft in empty sky. Then the Zeros would fly directly into those tracers. Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation Intelligence analyzed the reports. Their conclusion was that Americans had developed a new gunite technology, some kind of predictive aiming system that calculated future positions automatically. The idea that American gunners were simply aiming farther ahead manually didn't occur to them. It seemed too simple, too crude. The Japanese assumed advanced technology because that's what they would have developed. This misunderstanding led to flawed countermeasures. Japanese pilots were told to make their maneuvers more unpredictable, change direction more frequently, vary speeds more radically. The theory was that unpredictable movement would confuse the American predictive gun sights, make the calculations fail. In practice, this made Zero pilots easier to hit, not harder. The reason was timing. When a Zero pilot made random direction changes every half second, he was actually making his future position more predictable, not less. A sharp turn meant the Zero would be in that turn for at least 1 full second due to physics and aircraft limitations. An American gunner using Parker's method could see the turn starting and aim for where the Zero would be mid-turn. The more aggressively the Zero maneuvered, the more committed it was to that maneuver path. Japanese aviation tacticians tried other approaches. They recommended attacking from dead, astern, where American gunners had the most difficult deflection angles. This worked briefly until American gunners adjusted their lead estimates for stern attacks. They recommended higher speed diving attacks to reduce the time American gunners had to react. This also failed because Parker's method worked at any speed. The gunner just aimed farther ahead for faster targets. Some Japanese squadrons tried coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously. The theory was that American gunners couldn't track multiple targets using complex predictive calculations. But Parker's method didn't require complex calculations. It required quick visual estimation. A skilled gunner could shift between targets and estimate lead for each one in under a second. Multiple attackers just gave the gunner multiple opportunities. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were trying to counter technology that didn't exist. They were developing tactics against predictive gun sights and computing devices when the reality was much simpler. American gunners were just aiming differently, using better judgment about where to point their guns. No special equipment, no advanced technology, just math and experience. By summer 1944, Zero loss rates to American rear gunners had increased by 300% compared to late 1943. Japanese aviation commanders knew something had changed, but they couldn't identify what. Their intelligence reports showed no new American gun sight models, no new gun systems, no technical modifications to American aircraft that would explain the increased accuracy. The misunderstanding persisted through the rest of the war. Japanese tactical documents captured after the war showed they continued to believe Americans had developed advanced predictive aiming technology. One report from August 1944 described American gunners using calculated firing solutions based on mechanical computers installed in gun positions. No such computers existed. The report was describing Parker's method, but interpreting it through a lens of assumed technological superiority. Japanese pilot training never adapted to counter the actual technique. They continued teaching evasion tactics designed to confuse predictive technology, rather than tactics to counter improved human judgment. They taught random maneuvers when steady flight with sudden brakes would have been more effective. They taught high-speed attacks when medium-speed attacks from unexpected angles would have given gunners less time to estimate lead. The irony was that the solution was simple. If Japanese intelligence had captured an American gunner and interrogated him properly, they would have learned the truth. Aim farther ahead. That's the whole secret. No technology, no computers, just different aiming points. But that never happened. The few American gunners who were captured either didn't know about Parker's method or didn't explain it in ways Japanese interrogators understood. The tactical advantage this created was enormous. American bomber formations that had been losing 10 to 15% of their aircraft to zero attacks in late 1943 were losing 3 to 5% by mid-1944. Part of that improvement came from better fighters escorting the bombers. Part came from declining Japanese pilot quality as experienced aviators were killed faster than they could be replaced. But a significant portion came from rear gunners who were simply shooting more accurately. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was they were fighting an enemy they didn't understand. Parker's deflection shooting method didn't receive official recognition until after the war ended. The Navy conducted a comprehensive study of gunnery effectiveness in 1946. They analyzed combat reports from every carrier squadron in the Pacific. The data showed that squadrons using extreme lead deflection had 3 times the kill rate of squadrons using standard doctrine. The study concluded that unauthorized field modifications to shooting technique had contributed significantly to American air superiority in the final 2 years of the war. By that point, it didn't matter. The method had already been integrated into combat practice across the fleet. Post-war gunnery training at Pensacola was quietly modified. Instructors started teaching larger lead angles. The official term became dynamic deflection shooting. The manual still didn't mention Parker by name, but the techniques described were exactly what he discovered over Rabole in November 1943. The principles spread beyond Navy gunners. Army Air Force tail gunners and B-17s and B-24s adopted similar methods for engaging German fighters over Europe. The same physics applied. BF-1099s and FW-190s maneuvered aggressively just like Zeros. Bullets still took time to reach their targets. Aiming at future positions still worked better than aiming at current positions. By early 1945, the technique was standard practice across all American air gunner positions. Korea brought the method into the jet age. MiG-15 fighters were faster than anything from World War II, 300 mph faster. The lead distances required were even more extreme. Gunners had to aim 15 to 20 aircraft lengths ahead, but the underlying principle remained unchanged. Predict where the target will be, aim there, fire. American gunners who'd learned the technique fighting Zeros adapted it for fighting MiGs. The method scaled with technology. Vietnam presented different challenges: helicopters instead of fighters, ground fire instead of aerial combat. But the deflection principle applied to any moving target. Door gunners engaging trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail used extreme lead deflection. They aimed where the truck would be in 2 seconds, not where it was. The technique Parker had developed 25 years earlier in a completely different war remained relevant. Modern air combat has largely eliminated human gunners. Fighter aircraft use radar-guided missiles. Bombers rely on electronic countermeasures. The few remaining gun systems are computer-controlled. The computers calculate deflection automatically. Lead angles, bullet flight time, target velocity. Everything Parker did mentally in half a second, computers now do in milliseconds. But the underlying mathematics are identical. The computers use Parker's principle. They just execute it faster. Richard Parker survived the war. He flew 43 combat missions as a Corsair rear gunner, credited with 17 confirmed kills and 9 probables. He was promoted to Aviation Chief Machinist Mate in January 1945, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions over Rabaul. The citation mentioned exceptional gunnery accuracy. It didn't mention that he'd invented a new shooting method. After the war, Parker returned to Sacramento, California. He worked as an aviation mechanic for Pacific Airlines for 32 years. Married, had 2 daughters. He rarely talked about the war except with other veterans who understood. The deflection shooting technique he developed became so standard, that most gunners who used it never knew where it came from. They just knew it worked. Parker died in 1991 at age 70. His obituary mentioned his Navy service. It didn't mention that thousands of American aircrew had survived because of a method he'd discovered by aiming at empty sky. The principle he'd proven over Rabaul Harbor continues to influence how military forces think about engaging fast-moving targets. Not through technology, not through better equipment, but through better understanding of how bullets and targets move through space and time. 17 confirmed kills, hundreds of gunners taught, thousands of lives saved, all because one machinist mate ignored the manual and trusted his judgment about where zero would be instead of where it was. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories